You can't read that." The words landed with the kind of cold confidence only a billionaire could afford. A few people laughed immediately. The safe kind of laughter. The kind rich people use when they know the powerful man at the table expects it. Crystal glasses hovered halfway to polished lips. A jazz piano hummed softly somewhere beneath the skyline of Manhattan, but inside the private ballroom of the Astoria Crown Hotel, the air suddenly felt thinner. Naomi Carter stood perfectly still beside the table, one hand holding a silver serving tray, the other gripping a thick stack of legal papers she had just picked up from the marble floor. The contract had slipped from the edge of the table after one of the investors carelessly knocked it over during a toast worth nearly $500 million. Ethan Whitmore adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit and leaned back in his chair like he owned gravity itself. At 39, the CEO of Whitmore Dynamics had the kind of face financial magazines loved. Sharp jawline, expensive haircut, eyes that rarely softened. Men feared him in boardrooms. Women admired him at galas. And tonight, surrounded by venture capital sharks, attorneys, and executives dressed in custom Italian wool, Ethan looked at Naomi the same way people looked at hotel wallpaper. Useful when needed. Invisible the rest of the time. Careful with that, he added with a smirk. That contract costs more than your yearly salary. Another wave of restrained laughter drifted across the table. Naomi said nothing. She simply lowered her eyes to the papers in her hand for half a second, long enough to notice something strange. A sentence buried deep inside the document caught her attention immediately. Her fingers tightened slightly against the pages. Around her, the room glowed with old money and new power. Amber chandeliers reflected against 20-foot windows overlooking Midtown Manhattan. The scent of whiskey, cigar smoke, and expensive cologne floated through the room like a second layer of wealth. Outside, rain streaked softly against the glass 70 stories above the city. Inside, nobody noticed the waitress reading. Nobody except Madeline Brooks. Seated halfway down the table in a dark emerald dress, the veteran investor quietly watched Naomi over the rim of her wine glass. Unlike the others, Madeline did not laugh. She noticed the way Naomi's eyes moved across the page. Calm, focused, intentional, not curious, understanding. "You hear me?" Ethan asked, amused now. "Or are those words too big for you?" This time the laughter came easier. One man actually shook his head while sipping bourbon. Naomi slowly lifted her eyes from the contract. Her expression remained controlled, but there was something unsettling about how calm she looked under pressure. No embarrassment, no panic, just stillness. The kind that made people uncomfortable without understanding why. "I can read it," she said quietly. Ethan smiled wider. "That's so." He leaned forward and slid his glass aside. "Then go ahead." The room shifted. Investors turned in their seats. Attorneys exchanged amused looks. Someone near the back quietly pulled out a phone. Ethan spread one arm dramatically toward Naomi like a king inviting entertainment into his court. "Read it aloud," he said. "Let's hear what our waitress thinks she understands." Naomi looked down at the contract again. The pages felt heavier now. Not because of the paper, because of what was hidden inside them. Her heart beat once, hard against her ribs. She recognized the clause immediately now. A liquidation trigger disguised beneath acquisition language. Buried deep enough that most people in the room probably missed it entirely, including Ethan Whitmore himself. Thunder rolled softly outside the windows. Somewhere behind the ballroom bar, a glass shattered. But nobody looked away from Naomi. Ethan rested comfortably in his chair, fully convinced this moment belonged to him. He had no idea the room was already slipping out of his control. Naomi placed the silver tray carefully onto a nearby serving station. Then she straightened the contract in her hands and took a slow breath. And for the first time that night, the waitress everyone ignored began to speak. Naomi's voice did not shake. That was the first thing people noticed. Not the words, not the contract itself, the calm. In a room full of executives trained to dominate conversations, the black waitress standing beside the table sounded more composed than all of them. Section 8.4, she read clearly, her voice carrying through the ballroom without effort. In the event of accelerated acquisition restructuring, controlling liquidation rights may be transferred to secondary investors without additional board approval. Silence settled slowly across the room. Thick, uncomfortable. Ethan Whitmore's smirk faded just slightly. Not gone, but weakened. Naomi continued reading, her eyes scanning the dense legal language with the ease of someone who had spent years studying it. This clause creates unilateral transfer authority under emergency valuation conditions. A man near the end of the table frowned. Another investor quietly lowered his drink. Victor Hale, Whitmore Dynamics lead attorney, suddenly leaned forward in his chair. "Wait," he interrupted. Naomi stopped reading and looked up calmly. Victor held out his hand. "Let me see that." She walked toward him and handed over the contract carefully. The attorney flipped rapidly through the pages, his expression tightening with every second. Across the ballroom, the sound of silverware and soft jazz returned in fragments, but inside the private dining section, nobody spoke. Ethan's jaw hardened. "Victor," he asked, irritation slipping into his voice now. The attorney did not answer immediately. His eyes raced across paragraph after paragraph before finally stopping at the same clause Naomi had noticed. Madeline Brooks watched him carefully. She had negotiated billion-dollar mergers for nearly 20 years. She knew exactly what fear looked like in corporate rooms. And Victor Hale suddenly looked afraid. "This amendment was not in the previous draft," Victor said quietly. Ethan straightened in his chair. "What?" Victor looked up slowly. "If we sign this version tonight, secondary investors could force liquidation authority during the transition period." One of the men across the table blinked in confusion. "Meaning what exactly?" Victor swallowed once. "Meaning Whitmore Dynamics could lose controlling ownership before the merger." Finalized. The room froze again. Not dramatic. Not loud. Worse. Controlled silence. The kind that arrives when wealthy people realize money is about to move in the wrong direction. Ethan stood abruptly from his chair. "That is impossible." Victor slid the contract across the table toward him. "It is right there." Ethan grabbed the pages, scanning the clause himself now. The confidence in his face began cracking around the edges. Tiny fractures. Tiny moments of disbelief. Naomi remained still beside the serving station, hands folded calmly in front of her apron. Nobody laughed anymore. One investor loosened his tie. Another quietly reached for his phone beneath the table. Rain hammered harder against the windows overlooking Manhattan. The city lights blurred through streaks of water 70 stories below. Madeline finally spoke, her voice smooth and measured. "How did your legal team miss that?" Nobody answered her. Victor looked humiliated. Ethan looked furious. But beneath the anger was something else now. Something far more dangerous to a man like him. Uncertainty. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes toward Naomi. For the first time all night, he actually looked at her. Not at the uniform. Not at the tray. At her. "How did you catch it?" he asked quietly. Naomi hesitated for only a second. "Because the wording changes halfway through the amendment," she said. "The acquisition language switches from protective to conditional. Most people would skim over it because the terminology sounds similar." Victor stared at her. "You studied corporate law?" Naomi gave a small nod. "For 3 years." One of the investors let out a stunned breath. Another shook his head in disbelief. Ethan remained silent, still holding the contract in his hands like it had suddenly become something dangerous. Madeline leaned back slowly in her chair, eyes still fixed on Naomi. "You may have just saved this company $500 million, she said. The words hit the room harder than any insult earlier that night, because everyone understood what they really meant. The waitress they ignored had seen what an entire table of millionaires failed to notice. Ethan glanced around the ballroom and realized something horrifying. Control had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, completely. And everyone in the room knew it. The atmosphere inside the Astoria Crown Hotel had changed completely. 30 minutes earlier, the private ballroom sounded like every other billionaire dinner in Manhattan. Confident laughter. Crystal glasses tapping together. Investors speaking in polished voices about acquisitions and market dominance, while servers moved silently around them like part of the furniture. But now the room carried a different sound. Hesitation. Nobody reached for their drinks anymore. Nobody interrupted. The energy that once belonged entirely to Ethan Whitmore now floated somewhere uncertain between the table and the woman standing beside it in a black waitress uniform. Ethan stared down at the contract again, scanning the same paragraph repeatedly as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less dangerous. But legal language did not care about ego. It sat there cold and permanent beneath the ballroom lights. Across the table, two investors whispered quietly to each other. Another executive pulled up the digital draft on his tablet with visible urgency. Victor Hale loosened his tie for the second time in 10 minutes. His face had lost color. Naomi noticed all of it. She had spent years observing powerful people from the edges of rooms exactly like this one. Wealth always looked untouchable from a distance. But up close, rich people panicked just like everyone else. Sometimes worse, because they were not used to losing control publicly. Madeline Brooks slowly rested her wine glass onto the table. "Who reviewed the final amendment package before tonight?" she asked calmly. Victor cleared his throat. "My department handled the revisions. Clearly not carefully enough." The sentence landed softly, but Victor looked like he had been slapped by it. Ethan suddenly closed the contract and looked directly at Naomi again. "You said you studied corporate law for 3 years," he said. "Where?" Naomi hesitated briefly. "Columbia." Several heads turned immediately. One investor actually blinked in disbelief. Columbia law was not the kind of school people associated with night shifts and serving cocktails. Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly. "You are telling me you attended Columbia Law School?" "I said I studied there," Naomi answered quietly. "I did not say I graduated." The room stayed silent. There was something about the way she answered questions that unsettled people. No defensiveness. No desperation to impress. Just facts. Ethan stepped away from the table slowly now, his expensive dress, shoes moving across the marble floor with measured restraint. "Then why are you working here?" It was not cruel this time. That was what made the question different. Earlier that night, Ethan had spoken to Naomi like she barely existed. Now he sounded like a man trying to solve a puzzle that no longer made sense to him. Naomi folded her hands calmly in front of her apron. "My mother got sick during my second year." Her voice remained even, but softer now. "Cancer." A few people lowered their eyes immediately. "I left school to help take care of her." Nobody interrupted. Even the jazz music from the ballroom downstairs felt distant now. Naomi continued carefully, almost like she regretted speaking about herself at all. "After she passed away, I could not afford tuition anymore. So I started working." Ethan looked at her for a long moment without speaking. The rain outside intensified again, streaking silver against the massive windows overlooking Manhattan. Far below, headlights crawled through wet streets like rivers of light. Madeline watched Ethan carefully now. She knew men like him better than most people did. Billionaires hated surprises. And tonight Naomi Carter had become the kind of surprise that shattered assumptions people built entire identities around. Ethan had spent years believing intelligence looked a certain way, sounded a certain way, dressed a certain way. And now a waitress standing beside a champagne cart had exposed a legal trap his own executives failed to catch. One of the younger investors finally spoke up from the far end of the table. "So you just remembered all that legal terminology from school?" Naomi shook her head slightly. "I still study." "While working here?" Naomi nodded. "Once. Every night during breaks." Nobody laughed at her now. Not after what happened. Not after the contract. Victor Hale slowly sank deeper into his chair, staring down at the table as though avoiding eye contact might somehow shrink the humiliation sitting in front of him. Ethan noticed it too. For the first time that evening, the most respected attorney in the room looked small, and the waitress everyone ignored did not. The silence around the table no longer felt accidental. It felt earned. Every person inside the private ballroom understood the hierarchy had shifted, even if nobody wanted to admit it aloud. Naomi Carter stood beside the serving station beneath the warm chandelier light, her black uniform crisp against the polished marble and gold around her. Just an hour earlier, guests barely acknowledged her existence except to request another drink or clear another plate. Now executives worth hundreds of millions of dollars watched her every movement carefully, as though speaking too quickly around her suddenly felt dangerous. Ethan Whitmore slowly placed the contract back onto the table. His expression remained controlled, but his eyes had changed. The arrogance was still there. Men like Ethan did not lose confidence overnight, but something else had entered the room alongside it. Respect. Reluctant. Uncomfortable. Real. Across the ballroom, two younger associates quietly whispered to each other while pretending not to stare at Naomi. One of them searched her name online beneath the table, hoping somehow she already existed in articles or law journals that could explain what had just happened. But there was nothing. No interviews. No corporate profile. No polished success story. Just silence. The kind society leaves around people it never bothers to notice. Victor Hale finally cleared his throat. The revised amendment package came from Baxter Capital 3 hours before dinner, he said carefully. We assumed the modifications were administrative. Madeline Brooks let out a slow breath through her nose. You assumed wrong. Victor looked away immediately. Ethan remained standing near the table, staring out at the rain-covered skyline beyond the glass walls. Manhattan glittered beneath the storm like a city pretending it had no cracks. Who added the clause? He asked quietly. Victor hesitated. It would have required approval from Baxter's legal side. Ethan turned sharply. So they tried to bury a control transfer inside a merger agreement? It appears that way. One investor muttered something under his breath. Another quietly reached for his phone and stepped away from the table entirely. Nobody trusted anyone fully anymore. Not after money this large nearly changed hands under false terms. Naomi noticed all of it while remaining perfectly still. She had seen enough wealthy people over the years to understand one thing clearly. The richer the room, the faster loyalty disappeared when power shifted. Madeline looked toward Naomi again. You caught that clause in less than 30 seconds. Naomi gave a small shrug. The wording pattern changed. Ethan looked back at her. Most attorneys in this city would not have spotted it. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. Most attorneys are not expected to stay invisible while they work. The sentence hit harder than anyone expected. No anger. No accusation. Just truth. Quiet truth always landed deepest in rooms built on image. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Somewhere behind him, lightning flashed across the clouds outside the windows, washing silver light over the ballroom for half a second. Naomi remembered another storm years earlier. A smaller apartment in Harlem. Her mother asleep on the couch beneath 2 blankets because chemotherapy made her cold even during summer. Naomi sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning surrounded by legal textbooks she could no longer afford to keep. Reading contracts while balancing overdue bills beside her coffee cup. Memorizing legal structures because studying was the only thing that made her feel like her old life had not completely disappeared. Back then nobody clapped for resilience. Nobody rewarded sacrifice. The world simply kept moving while people like Naomi learned how to survive quietly. Ethan interrupted her thoughts without realizing it. Why did you not go back? Naomi looked at him. To law school. She paused briefly. Life got expensive. Nobody smiled at the answer because everyone at the table understood exactly what she meant. Wealth insulated people from choices like that. It allowed men like Ethan Whitmore to call ambition discipline instead of privilege. Madeline slowly folded her hands together. You still think like an attorney. Naomi gave the smallest hint of a smile. Thinking was free. That finally broke something in the room. Not tension. Ego. One investor actually looked embarrassed now. Another avoided eye contact entirely. Ethan stared at Naomi for several long seconds without speaking. Earlier that night, he had reduced her to a joke in front of an audience. Now every person in the ballroom knew something he did not want to admit to himself. The smartest voice in the room had belonged to the woman carrying the drinks. The storm outside Manhattan continued to build, turning the glass walls of the Astoria Crown Hotel into mirrors streaked with rain and city light. Inside the ballroom, the dinner had stopped pretending to be a celebration. Plates sat untouched beneath golden chandeliers. Half-melted ice drifted through expensive whiskey glasses while conversations died unfinished around the table. Nobody cared about the menu anymore. Nobody cared about the speeches prepared for the merger announcement. All attention had narrowed toward one uncomfortable truth sitting in the middle of the table beside the contract. Naomi Carter had been right. Ethan Whitmore slowly returned to his chair, but he no longer looked like the man who had walked into the room earlier that evening expecting absolute control. His confidence still existed. Men like Ethan built billion-dollar companies because they knew how to survive pressure. But survival and dominance were not the same thing. And tonight, dominance had slipped through his fingers in front of people whose opinions shaped markets. Victor Hale continued reviewing the amendment pages with growing frustration. There are 3 additional discrepancies, he admitted quietly. A low murmur spread around the table immediately. Madeline Brooks narrowed her eyes. 3. Victor nodded once. Minor wording. Adjustments tied to valuation triggers and asset restructuring. One investor leaned forward sharply. Minor. Victor looked exhausted now. Not minor enough. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose, staring at the skyline beyond the rain-covered windows. He had spent 15 years building Whitmore Dynamics from a tiny office in Boston into one of the most aggressive technology firms in the country. He survived hostile investors, collapsing markets, lawsuits, betrayals, and competitors who wanted him erased. But somehow the closest call came from a clause hidden inside a contract reviewed by his own legal department while a waitress noticed it carrying champagne across the room. The irony sat in his chest like broken glass. Madeline turned toward Naomi again. "Did you notice anything else?" The room immediately quieted. Naomi hesitated briefly. Her instincts warned her not to speak further. Not because she doubted herself. Because she understood what happened when powerful people felt exposed publicly. But then she looked at the contract again. At the language. At the numbers. And she spoke anyway. The restructuring percentages do not match the original valuation summary. Victor looked up instantly. "What?" Naomi stepped closer to the table carefully. Page 53. Victor flipped quickly through the document again. Ethan watched her now with complete attention. Not amusement. Not curiosity. Attention. Naomi pointed toward a paragraph near the bottom of the page. The percentages were adjusted by decimal placement. One investor frowned. "What difference does that make?" Naomi answered calmly. "About $80 million. The room exploded into overlapping voices immediately. Chairs shifted sharply against marble floors. One executive grabbed his tablet, while another started calling someone outside the ballroom. Victor's face drained completely. "She is right," he whispered. Ethan stared down at the numbers, jaw tightening hard enough to show beneath the ballroom lights. $80 million hidden through decimal manipulation. Not enough to attract immediate attention. Just enough to disappear beneath corporate complexity if nobody looked carefully. Madeline let out a quiet breath. "This was not sloppy drafting," she said. "This was intentional." Nobody argued with her. Naomi stepped back from the table instinctively, trying once again to return to invisibility. But invisibility was gone now. Every person in the room kept looking toward her like she had suddenly become the only trustworthy voice left inside the ballroom. Ethan slowly rose from his chair again. This time there was no performance in the movement. No billionaire swagger. Just tension. He walked toward the massive windows overlooking Manhattan and rested one hand against the glass. Rainwater streaked down beside his reflection while traffic glowed below in blurred ribbons of red and white. "If we sign tonight," he said quietly, "they would have stripped control from the company within 6 months." Victor lowered his head. Nobody answered because everyone knew he was right. Ethan turned slowly back toward the room. His eyes found Naomi again almost immediately. "You saved us." The sentence landed heavily across the table. Not because of the words themselves. Because Ethan Whitmore sounded like a man speaking a truth he never imagined he would have to say aloud. Naomi shifted uncomfortably beneath the attention. "I just read the contract." Madeline gave a faint smile. "No," she said softly. "You saw what everyone else chose not to see." And in that moment, surrounded by investors, attorneys, marble floors, and billion-dollar negotiations, the room finally understood something terrifyingly simple. Intelligence did not always arrive wearing a tailored suit. The ballroom no longer felt like a place designed for celebration. It felt like a courtroom where nobody knew who was guilty yet. Rain continued sliding down the towering windows of the Astoria Crown Hotel, while Manhattan shimmered below in silver and gold reflections. The city looked calm from 70 stories up. Inside the private dining room, nothing was calm anymore. Phones buzzed constantly across the table. Executives whispered into headsets near the entrance. Baxter Capital representatives had suddenly become unreachable, which only deepened the tension spreading through the room like smoke. Ethan Whitmore stood near the center of the ballroom, one hand resting against the back of his chair, while Victor Hale continued reviewing every page of the contract with visible panic. Nobody trusted the document anymore. Not after the hidden clauses. Not after the missing decimal manipulations. And definitely not after the waitress found them first. Naomi Carter quietly stepped toward the side station where untouched champagne glasses still waited beneath soft amber lights. Her instincts told her to leave the room now. She had already said too much. Done too much. People like her were not supposed to become central figures in rooms filled with billionaires. They were supposed to serve quietly, disappear quietly, and survive quietly. But before she could move farther away, Ethan's voice stopped her. Naomi. The sound of her name coming from him changed the atmosphere instantly. Earlier that evening, he called her sweetheart, like she barely deserved individuality. Now he said her name carefully, almost respectfully, and every person at the table noticed the difference. Naomi turned slowly. Ethan walked toward her with measured steps, no longer trying to perform confidence for the room. I need you to look at something else. Victor immediately glanced up from the table. Ethan, with all respect, this is now a legal issue. Exactly. Ethan replied without taking his eyes off Naomi. And apparently she is the only person here actually reading the contract. The sentence hit Victor harder than any public insult could have. The attorney lowered his eyes immediately, while several investors exchanged uncomfortable glances. Naomi hesitated. I am not a licensed attorney. Neither are the people who almost cost me my company tonight. Ethan answered quietly. The room fell silent again. Naomi slowly walked back toward the table while thunder rolled somewhere above Manhattan. Victor pushed another section of documents toward her with reluctant frustration. She could feel his embarrassment filling the room before he even spoke. These are the supplementary disclosures, he muttered. Naomi sat carefully at the edge of the table, smoothing the papers beneath the chandelier light. The contrast almost looked unreal. A woman in a black service uniform sitting among men wearing watches worth more than most apartments in Brooklyn. But nobody questioned her place there anymore. Not after tonight. Naomi scanned the disclosures line by line while conversations around the ballroom softened into nervous whispers. Ethan remained standing beside her now, close enough to see the movement of her eyes across the page. For the first time in years, he realized he had completely misjudged someone based on appearance within the first 30 seconds of meeting them. And worse than that, he had done it confidently. Naomi suddenly stopped reading. Her expression changed only slightly, but Ethan noticed immediately. What is it? He asked. Naomi looked up slowly. This is not just about the merger. Victor frowned. What do you mean? Naomi turned the page toward them and pointed to a paragraph buried inside the disclosure section. There is a contingency transfer tied to patent ownership. Ethan's face hardened instantly. Whitmore Dynamics patents were worth billions. Explain. Naomi swallowed once before continuing. If the restructuring failed after acquisition, Baxter Capital would gain temporary licensing control over your artificial intelligence patents during arbitration. The room erupted again. One investor actually stood up from his chair in disbelief. Victor grabbed the documents from Naomi and flipped through them rapidly. That cannot be legal. Naomi answered quietly. It is if nobody challenges the arbitration language. Ethan stared at the contract with growing disbelief. This was bigger than a merger trap now. Much bigger. Someone had designed this deal carefully enough to look legitimate under pressure while quietly carving away pieces of his company beneath layers of legal complexity. Madeline Brooks slowly rose from her chair and looked directly at Naomi. Do you understand what you just uncovered? Naomi shook her head slightly. I understand somebody expected nobody to pay attention. Madeline gave a faint smile, filled with something close to admiration. No, she said softly. Somebody expected nobody like you to pay attention. And that was the moment the entire room finally confronted the ugliest truth hiding beneath the contracts, the money, and the polished luxury around them. They had not overlooked Naomi because she lacked intelligence. They overlooked her because they never imagined intelligence could look like her at all. The private ballroom at the Astoria Crown Hotel had become something no billionaire dinner was ever supposed to become. Honest. The polished performance was gone now. Gone were the rehearsed smiles, the confident speeches about innovation, the smooth investor language people used when billions of dollars sat on the table. What remained was tension stripped bare beneath chandelier light. Phones continued buzzing across the room as legal teams from 3 different cities scrambled to review the merger documents in real time. Baxter Capital representatives still refused to answer calls. That silence alone told Ethan Whitmore everything he needed to know. This had been planned. Carefully. Deliberately. And if Naomi Carter had not spotted the hidden clauses tonight, Whitmore Dynamics could have walked straight into a financial disaster wearing a champagne smile. Ethan stood near the head of the table, one hand resting against the polished walnut surface while executives argued quietly around him. But his attention kept drifting back toward Naomi. She sat calmly beside stacks of contracts and disclosure forms, still wearing the same black apron she had on while serving drinks 2 hours earlier. The contrast unsettled him more every minute. Ethan had spent most of his adult life believing success revealed itself visibly. Expensive education, tailored suits, powerful titles. People at the top were supposed to look like they belonged there. That belief had shaped the way he treated nearly everyone around him, especially people beneath his social world. And now a woman carrying appetizer trays had exposed weaknesses his own executives failed to catch despite earning seven-figure salaries. Madeline Brooks quietly approached Naomi with another tablet in hand. "There is an earlier draft from last week," she said. "Can you compare the language?" Naomi accepted the tablet carefully. "I can try." Victor Hale looked deeply uncomfortable hearing those words in front of the room. Every minute Naomi continued helping only magnified his humiliation further. One of the younger associates leaned toward another and whispered something under his breath. Ethan caught only part of it. How is she working here? Not how is she reading contracts? Not how is she understanding arbitration law? Just disbelief that someone this intelligent existed outside the spaces wealthy people considered appropriate. Naomi studied the earlier draft quietly while thunder rolled again across Manhattan. The ballroom lights flickered for half a second before stabilizing. Outside the windows, rain blurred the city into streaks of silver and blue. Inside, every eye kept drifting back toward Naomi whether people realized it or not. She suddenly tapped the screen once and looked up. "This version is clean." Victor frowned immediately, meaning Naomi rotated the tablet toward him. The arbitration language was added later. So was the patent contingency. Ethan stepped closer. "Can you prove it?" Naomi pointed carefully toward the metadata timestamps attached to the document revisions. "The formatting shifts here and here. Somebody inserted new legal sections after the original review process." Victor stared at the screen in stunned silence. Madeline let out a low breath. "That means someone inside Baxter Capital coordinated this intentionally." Ethan's expression darkened immediately. One investor muttered a curse beneath his breath, while another quietly stood and stepped away to make another phone call. The room no longer looked glamorous now. It looked tired, exposed, human. Naomi lowered the tablet slowly. "I think they assumed everyone would focus on the acquisition numbers and skip the legal language." Ethan gave a bitter laugh without humor. They were almost right. Naomi glanced toward him briefly. "Most people see what they expect to see." The sentence lingered in the room heavily. Ethan understood she was not talking only about contracts anymore. For years he walked through rooms exactly like this one, assuming intelligence wore luxury watches and Ivy League confidence. Assuming waitresses carried trays instead of insight. Assuming women like Naomi existed on the edges of important conversations rather than at the center of them. And tonight, every one of those assumptions collapsed publicly beneath the same chandelier lights where he mocked her hours earlier. Victor suddenly looked up from the documents again. "There is enough here to halt the merger entirely." One investor responded immediately. "Good. Halt it." Another executive nodded in agreement. "If this gets public before we control the narrative, Whitmore stock will take a hit by morning." Ethan remained silent for several long seconds. Then he slowly looked toward Naomi again. Not above her. Not through her. At her. "You realize," he said quietly, "every person in this room owes you tonight." Naomi looked uncomfortable hearing it aloud. She folded her hands carefully in front of her and answered in the same calm voice she had used all evening. "No," she said softly. "You all just finally listened." By 11:40 that night, the merger dinner at the Astoria Crown Hotel had transformed into the kind of story Wall Street tried desperately to keep private. The ballroom still glowed beneath gold chandeliers. Servers still moved quietly between marble tables carrying untouched desserts and melting ice buckets. But beneath the luxury, panic traveled faster than champagne ever could. Legal teams from New York, Chicago, and San Francisco now filled the private conference line connected to Ethan Whitmore's table. Words like arbitration fraud, disclosure manipulation, and emergency injunction floated through the room in sharp bursts of tension. Nobody from Baxter Capital had returned a single call. That silence spoke louder than any confession. Naomi Carter stood near the side station once again, trying to disappear back into the edges of the ballroom where she felt safest. But invisibility was impossible now. Every executive in the room kept glancing toward her, whether intentionally or not. Some with admiration, some with embarrassment, some with the uncomfortable realization that they had spent years underestimating people simply because society taught them who looked important and who did not. Ethan Whitmore sat at the head of the table staring down at his phone while headlines already began surfacing across financial media alerts. Rumors moved quickly in Manhattan, especially when billion-dollar deals suddenly froze hours before signing. One notification appeared after another across his screen. Whitmore Dynamics delays acquisition announcement. Questions emerging around Baxter Capital merger terms. Insiders report last-minute legal review. Ethan rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw, exhausted in a way money could not solve. Across from him, Madeline Brooks quietly watched the room. She had survived corporate America long enough to recognize a rare moment when power changed shape in real time. And tonight, that shift had not come from a board member or investor. It came from a black waitress carrying contracts beside a champagne cart. Near the ballroom entrance, two junior associates whispered while staring at their phones. One of them suddenly looked shocked. "Oh my God," he muttered. The other grabbed the phone immediately. A short video clip had already started circulating online. Grainy cell phone footage from earlier in the evening. Ethan's voice clear enough to hear over the music. "You cannot read that." Then Naomi, standing beneath chandelier light, calmly reading the contract aloud while executives around her slowly fell silent. Somebody had uploaded the moment less than 20 minutes earlier, and the internet was already doing what the internet always did with arrogance exposed publicly. The comments multiplied by the second. The waitress caught what millionaire lawyers missed. "This woman deserves the corner office." He mocked her before she saved his company. "Never underestimate people you refuse to see." Ethan stared at the video in silence after one associate nervously handed him the phone. Watching himself from another angle unsettled him deeply. The confidence, the dismissive smile, the casual superiority in his voice. He barely recognized how cruel he sounded until he heard it reflected back publicly. Across the room, Naomi noticed several employees looking at her differently now. Two. The same hotel staff who once hurried past her without conversation suddenly smiled carefully when making eye contact. Not because she changed, because now wealthy people had confirmed her value first. That realization hurt more than she expected. Madeline slowly walked over toward Naomi near the service station. "How are you holding up?" Naomi gave a small shrug. "I still have another hour on my shift." Madeline laughed softly beneath her breath. That might be the most grounded sentence spoken in this room tonight. Nearby, Victor Hale remained buried beneath legal documents and conference calls, trying desperately to repair both the merger situation and his own damaged reputation. Every few minutes, someone else asked Naomi another question about the contracts. Every time she answered calmly without ego. No performance, no revenge, no public victory speech, just clarity. Ethan eventually stood from the table and looked toward the ballroom windows again, where rain continued pouring over Manhattan like silver rivers against glass. The city outside looked enormous and indifferent. Somewhere below, millions of people moved through their lives without ever stepping inside rooms like this one. And yet tonight, the most important voice in the building belonged to someone society trained itself not to notice. Ethan finally turned back toward Naomi again. Not with pity, not with guilt alone, with understanding beginning to form slowly beneath the wreckage of his pride. Because for the first time in years, Ethan Whitmore realized something terrifyingly simple. The room had never belonged to the loudest person in it. It belonged to the person who actually understood what everyone else missed. By 1:15 in the morning, the Astoria Crown Hotel had finally gone quiet. Most of the investors were gone. The emergency legal calls had slowed to exhausted murmurs. Half-empty glasses still covered the ballroom tables beneath fading chandelier light, while Manhattan glowed beyond the rain-soaked windows like a city too restless to sleep. The merger was officially suspended. Baxter Capital's legal team had stopped responding completely after Whitmore Dynamics threatened a federal investigation into disclosure fraud and arbitration manipulation. Financial news networks were already dissecting the collapse online before midnight reached the West Coast. But inside the nearly empty ballroom, none of that felt as important anymore. Naomi Carter stood alone near the service hallway, rolling silverware into linen napkins beside a stainless steel prep counter. Her shift was finally ending. The black apron still tied around her waist looked strangely ordinary after everything that happened that night. Around her, hotel employees whispered quietly while pretending not to stare. Some smiled nervously when passing by. Others offered awkward congratulations she did not know how to answer. Naomi responded politely every time, but deep down she felt tired more than victorious. People suddenly treated her differently because powerful men finally approved of her intelligence publicly. That part hurt in ways she could not explain aloud. She reached for another stack of silverware when she heard footsteps approaching behind her. Slow, careful, not entitled anymore. Naomi turned slightly and saw Ethan Whitmore standing near the service entrance without his jacket on for the first time all evening. His tie hung loose around his collar now, and exhaustion sat heavily beneath his eyes. Without the ballroom lights and billionaire posture surrounding him, he looked less like a magazine cover and more like a man carrying the weight of a very long night. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The soft hum of refrigerators and distant elevator bells filled the silence between them. Ethan glanced down at the neatly folded napkins in her hands before finally speaking. "You are really still working." Naomi gave a faint smile. "The hotel still closes at 2. Ethan let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Right." Another silence settled between them, but this one felt different from the earlier tensions in the ballroom. Smaller. Human. Ethan slowly stepped closer to the prep counter. "I watched that video again." Naomi already knew which video he meant. "The internet moves fast," she said softly. Ethan nodded once. "So does humiliation." Naomi looked at him carefully then. Earlier that evening, she would have expected defensiveness from someone like Ethan. Excuses, ego, anger at being embarrassed publicly. But none of that appeared in his face now. Only honesty. "I was wrong about you," he admitted quietly. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly toward the silverware in her hands. "Most people are." The sentence landed softly, but Ethan felt every word inside it. Not bitterness. Worse, familiarity. Like disappointment she had learned to live with long ago. Ethan rested both hands against the edge of the prep counter. "When you picked up that contract tonight," he said slowly, "I looked at you and saw a waitress." Naomi finally looked up at him fully. Ethan continued carefully, almost forcing himself to say the truth aloud. "I never once considered the possibility that you might be the smartest person in the room." Naomi studied him silently for a second before answering. "That is because people usually see uniforms before they see people." Ethan had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without blinking. He had survived boardroom attacks from investors twice his age. But somehow that sentence hit harder than anything said to him in years. Because deep down he knew she was right. Wealth trained people to measure value visually. Expensive suits meant intelligence. Service uniforms meant invisibility. And tonight a woman everyone overlooked had protected his company while millionaires failed around her. Ethan reached slowly into his pocket and placed a business card on the counter between them. Thick white stock. Minimalist black lettering. His direct number handwritten across the back in ink. Naomi looked down at it, but did not touch it. "Whitmore Dynamics needs people who can actually see what others miss," Ethan said. "Not people who just look impressive during presentations." Naomi remained quiet. Ethan gave a small, tired smile. "I do not expect you to trust me after tonight." "Good," Naomi replied softly. "Because trust is expensive too." Ethan laughed once under his breath, surprised despite himself. Then the silence returned again, but warmer this time. Outside the service hallway windows, rain finally began slowing over Manhattan. Ethan straightened slowly and looked at Naomi one last time before stepping back toward the ballroom entrance. "For what it is worth," he said quietly, "you changed more than a contract tonight." Naomi watched him carefully as he disappeared down the hallway beneath fading hotel lights. Then she looked down at the business card still resting on the stainless steel counter beside folded napkins and polished silverware. Hours earlier, Ethan Whitmore believed power belonged to the loudest person in the room. But that night, inside a ballroom built for billionaires, a black waitress taught everyone something money could never buy. Respect begins the moment people finally choose to see what was always there.